The land had once been kind to Thomas Cole, or at least fair, but now it seemed to resist him at every turn. The fences leaned as if the earth itself had grown tired of holding them upright, and the posts splintered under his calloused hands, no matter how often he tried to mend them. The well, once a faithful promise in the center of the yard, gave less with every bucket, the rope groaning as if it too wanted to snap and be done. The cattle were thin, their ribs showing through hides that should have been full by summer's end, and each time he looked at them, Thomas felt the weight of his debts pressing harder against his chest. He carried them alone, since there was no one else left, his wife long gone in the ground, and the few hired hands he once trusted vanished when pay grew too scarce. The neighbors called him proud, though not always kindly. They said pride was the only thing keeping him on land that no longer wanted him, that a wiser man would have walked away before the soil swallowed him whole. In town, when he passed the saloon or the store, men tipped their hats without respect, more out of habit than warmth, and women whispered that he looked older than his years, shoulders bent under a burden no one cared to share. Some said he would not make it through winter, and Thomas, hearing them, never argued. Each morning he rose before the first light, the air sharp in his lungs, and he pushed his body through chores that never seemed to end. The barn door sagged on its hinges, the corral needed mending, and the roof of the house let in rain when the storms rolled across the plains. His hands cracked and bled from rope and wood, and though he wrapped them at night, by dawn they were raw again. The silence of the ranch pressed heavy, broken only by the groan of wind through the cottonwoods or the faint low of a cow searching for grass that would not grow. Sometimes Thomas stood on the porch at dusk, the horizon burning red, and felt as though the land were testing him, daring him to leave or to prove he was more stubborn than dust and drought. He thought of his wife, Sarah, and the way she had smiled even when the crops failed, her hands gentle on his face, when he muttered about giving up. She had been the reason he stayed then, and when the fever took her, he stayed still, as if leaving would mean her memory had been for nothing. Now he stayed because he had no other skill but working this soil, no other life but the one carved into his bones. The ranch was failing, and so was he, but Thomas Cole did not know how to stop, did not know how to loosen his grip on land that had raised him and broken him both. So he bent his head, tightened his jaw, and kept working, even as whispers followed him like shadows, even as he knew they might be right. The evening sun hung low over the town, spilling long shadows across the dust that never seemed to settle, and Thomas Cole tied his mare outside the store with the same tired care he gave to every chore. He had come for flour and nails, nothing more, yet fate had a way of slipping into places he did not expect. Across the street, a wagon had rolled to a stop, its wheels wobbling, the driver climbing down with a girl at his side. She was thin as a fence rail, her black hair tangled like brush after a storm, and her pale eyes stared at the ground as though she had learned long ago that looking up only invited trouble. Folks began to gather, curious at first, then whispering, and Thomas heard the word fall from their lips with the sharpness of spit, cursed. The driver, a thick man with a red face and dust caked on his boots, raised his arms as if presenting some pitiful thing. 14, maybe, he said, though she looked smaller from hunger, and he claimed she was no use to him or anyone else. He muttered about her mother dying in screams, and her father lost in the mines, gone without a body to bury, and he said the girl brought nothing but bad luck. The crowd, never needing much reason to sneer, nodded and muttered agreement, some crossing themselves, others laughing cruelly. A woman clutched her child's hand tighter when the girl glanced up, those pale eyes flickering with something unreadable, and Thomas saw how quick they looked away, as though her gaze alone could sour their crops. The driver shoved her forward a little, calling her useless, saying she would not talk, saying she had the devil's shadow on her, and he offered her cheap to anyone desperate enough to take her. No one stepped forward, no one except to mutter that they would not let such bad luck through their door. The girl stood still, shoulders tight, hands knotted at her sides, and not a word passed her lips. Thomas could not look away. He told himself it was none of his business, that he had enough burdens already. Yet the longer he watched, the harder it became to turn. She did not cry. She did not beg. She only stood as if this moment was no different than the rest of her life, and that broke something inside him more than tears would have. He stepped forward before he knew why, his voice low, asking how much. The driver blinked, then grinned with the ugly relief of a man rid of a weight. A few coins changed hands, not much more than the cost of nails, and the girl was shoved toward Thomas as if she were a sack of grain. She stumbled but did not fall, lifting her chin just enough to meet his eyes. He saw no curse there, only a hollow weariness that matched his own. And though he had no place for her, no plan, he took her reins in silence and led her toward the waiting mare, the crowd's whispers chasing them down the street like smoke. Thomas had not risen that morning with any thought of bringing another mouth to the ranch. He had only wanted flour, nails, and maybe a length of rope if the price was fair. But by the time the sun began to sink, he found himself walking away from town with a girl trailing behind him, a girl everyone called cursed. He told himself it was not choice but circumstance, yet the truth pressed hard against his chest. He had seen how she stood while the crowd jeered, her shoulders set as if she had grown used to being treated like filth, and something inside him twisted until he could not stand still. His hand had gone to his pocket, his voice had offered the price, and a few coins later she was his whether he had wanted her or not. The driver had grinned with relief, wiping his palms as if to be rid of some sickness, and the crowd had watched Thomas with open disbelief. Some muttered he had taken on ruin. Others laughed that the rancher who could not even keep his fences straight now dragged home a girl who would sink him further. Thomas heard them, but did not look back. The girl walked behind him without sound, her steps light but steady, her pale eyes fixed somewhere far away. At the edge of town he mounted his mare and glanced down, meaning to offer her a hand. But she was already pulling herself up with a sharpness that surprised him. She did not thank him, she did not curse him. She simply settled onto the back of the horse with the blanket he tossed her and sat stiff as a soldier. They rode in silence down the long stretch of road, dust curling up around them, the last shouts from town fading into the wind. Thomas tried not to think about what he had done. The ranch was failing, and now he had a girl to feed who would not speak, who carried a name that brought only suspicion. He told himself he would find work for her, small chores, something to justify the coins he had spent. But deep down he knew it had not been about labor or worth. It had been about the way her face had held no hope, no plea, only the worn look of someone too tired to resist. He had recognized it, because he wore the same look in the mirror most mornings. By the time the ranch came into sight, the sun had dipped low and the sky stretched red across the horizon. The girl slipped from the horse without waiting for him and stood staring at the house, the barn, the crooked fences. She did not sneer or sigh, only studied it like she was measuring whether it would stand another winter. Thomas led the mare to water, feeling the silence stretch, and when he glanced back, she was still there, clutching the blanket tight. He wanted to ask her name, wanted to tell her she could speak if she wished, but no words came. Instead, he only nodded toward the door and said quietly that supper would be thin but warm. She followed, and though nothing had been agreed upon, the bargain was sealed in the dust behind them. A choice made without plan, yet one that already felt impossible to undo. The house had not known another voice in years, and it did not gain one now. The girl moved through its rooms like a shadow, eating little and speaking less, her pale eyes following Thomas in a way that made him uneasy, as if she were weighing every breath he took and storing it away. He tried at first to coax her and to talk, asking simple things: her name, where she came from, whether she could read or write, but she only stared until the silence grew thick, and he let it fall. Supper was always quiet. the scrape of his spoon against the bowl in the only sound. And when she finished, she would rise without a word, carrying her dish to the basin and washing it as if she had done so her whole life. At night, when the lamp was blown out and the boards creaked under the cooling air, Thomas sometimes heard her voice. It was not speaking to him, but to herself, soft and broken, like fragments of prayer or memory. He lay awake, staring at the ceiling, listening for words he could catch, but they slipped away like smoke, leaving only the sense that she carried something heavy inside her. More than once he wondered if the townsfolk had been right, if she was touched by madness or haunted by whatever curse they whispered. He told himself it made no difference, since he had already taken her in. Yet the thought lingered and made his nights restless. She worked without being told, sweeping the floor, gathering kindling, hauling water from the well, though it nearly outweighed her. She never complained, never asked for more than what she was given. When he left tools on the ground, she gathered them and set them in their place. When he came in from the fields, she had already stoked the fire. It unsettled him, not because the work was unwelcome, but because it was done in silence, her pale eyes flicking to him, only long enough to judge his mood before slipping away. One night the coyotes came, their howls sharp and close, circling the chicken coop. Thomas had just risen from his chair when he saw her already outside, a lantern in her hand, its glow steady against the dark. She stood by the coop like a sentinel, shoulders straight, her hair whipping in the wind but her arms steady, casting light that kept the coyotes back. They whined and slunk away, and when Thomas reached her, she only turned, her face calm, as if she had expected them, and would have stood there all night if need be. He took the lantern from her and told her she should have called him, but she said nothing, only walked back inside with her thin shoulders squared. Thomas watched her go and felt a strange pull in his chest. Haunted or not, cursed or not, the girl was no burden, like they said. She carried her silence like armor, and though it chilled him at times, it also steadied the house in a way he had not felt since Sarah's laughter had faded from its walls. He banked the fire that night with a thought he would not speak, that maybe she belonged here more than either of them yet understood. The first time Thomas took her into town, the sun was high, and the dust curled in small clouds under the mare's hooves, the kind of day when nothing should have felt heavy, yet it did. She walked beside him carrying a small sack of eggs, her hair in tangles as always, her eyes pale against the shadow of her face. Folks noticed before they even reached the store, and the whispers began like a breeze that thickened into storm. Men leaned against posts and muttered about hexes. Women drew their children close and crossed themselves quick, as if her glance alone could bring fever to their homes. Children, bold in packs, followed at a distance, chanting the word cursed under their breath, their voices mocking and sharp. Thomas kept his head down, jaw set, telling himself he could ignore it, but the sound gnawed at him all the same. Inside the store the talk did not quiet. The clerk kept his eyes on Thomas and never once looked at the girl, as though pretending she was not there might keep him safe. Thomas ordered flour and sugar, laid down his coins, and felt the weight of every stare on his back. The girl said nothing, her shoulders stiff, her hands gripping the sack until her knuckles turned white. He wanted to tell her not to mind them, but the words stuck. He had lived long enough to know that telling someone to forget cruelty never made it vanish. On the way out, the crowd seemed thicker. A ranch hand stumbled forward, half drunk, his face red and slick with sweat. He looked the girl up and down with a sneer, muttering about devil eyes and curses. Thomas moved to step between them, but the man was quicker, his hand latching onto her thin arm with a roughness that made Thomas's blood rise. He expected her to cry out, to shrink back, but she did neither. She lifted her chin and fixed those pale eyes on the man's face, her stare cold as river stone. For a moment no one breathed, and then the ranch hand's grin faltered. The color drained from him as if he had seen something he could not name, and with a jerk he let her go, stumbling back, muttering curses that sounded less certain now. The crowd shifted, uneasy. and Thomas guided her away without a word, his hand steady at her shoulder. They walked to the horse in silence, the girl still holding the sack of eggs unbroken, her face unreadable. He lifted her onto the mare and climbed up after, the crowd parting but never quieting, their whispers following them down the road like burrs caught in cloth. Only when the town lay behind them and the prairie stretched wide again did Thomas breathe easier. He glanced at her then, wanting to say he was sorry, wanting to promise she was safe, but she only stared ahead, her eyes fixed on the horizon, her face calm in a way that unsettled him. He thought again of the word cursed, but for the first time he wondered if it belonged less to her and more to those too small to face what they feared. The weeks passed slow and steady, the ranch holding its breath against the weight of the season, and the girl moved through it as if she had always been there. She rose with the dawn without being told, her thin figure bent over broken boards as she mended the fences that sagged along the pasture, her small hands steady where Thomas's had begun to tremble with wear. She worked in silence, but her silence was not empty. It was careful, measured, as though every task she touched was part of some vow she had made to herself. The weak mare that no hired hand had managed to steady stood calm under her care, nosing into her tangled hair while she brushed its coat. Her pale eyes softened for the first time Thomas could remember. He watched from the porch and wondered if he had been wrong about her, if perhaps she carried not a curse but a patience the rest of the world had never seen. One evening the fever came on him sudden, knocking him down harder than a blow. He had been hauling feed when the world tilted and he dropped to his knees in the dust, sweat soaking through his shirt, though the air was cool. He remembered trying to stand, remembered his own breath rattling, then darkness. When he woke, it was to the cool press of a damp cloth against his brow, and the faint smell of herbs crushed sharp in water. She sat beside the bed, her hands sure though her face held worry. She dipped the cloth again, placed it back against his skin, and for the first time he heard her voice, soft but steady, telling him to rest. He wanted to ask how she knew what to do, but the fever pulled him down again, and her voice followed him into dreams like a thread holding him still. By the next day the worst had passed. Though his body ached and his head felt heavy, she brought him broth in a chipped bowl, stood waiting until he drank every drop, and only then allowed herself to sit. He studied her, this strange child the world had cast off, and asked again for her name. For a long moment she only stared, those pale eyes searching his face as if to decide whether he deserved it. Then, at last, her lips moved, and the sound was quiet but clear, Elara. The word lingered in the room, delicate as glass, and Thomas felt it strike deeper than he expected. It was not just a name, it was a secret, entrusted, a door opening after weeks of silence. He repeated it once, careful, and she nodded, her mouth twitching with something that might have been the shadow of a smile. He did not press her with questions, did not ask for more than what she gave. It was enough that she had offered it at all. That night when he lay in bed, the fever easing and the house quiet again, he whispered her name into the dark, and it felt like the beginning of something he could not yet name, something steady and alive, like the first stir of spring beneath frozen ground. The night was still when the sound of hooves broke it apart, the kind of sound that carried a warning long before danger showed its face. Thomas rose from his chair, the lamplight shaking across the walls as he listened. Riders moved in a circle around the house, their voices sharp in the dark, calling him a fool for sheltering a cursed witch. Their laughter was bitter, the kind that masked fear with cruelty, and it cut through the night like a knife. Elara sat at the table, her pale eyes fixed on the window, her body tense but not trembling. Thomas reached for his rifle propped in the corner, his mind already racing. But before his hand touched the stock, a stone shattered the glass, scattering shards across the floor. The wind rushed in, carrying with it the smell of dust and horses, and Thomas cursed under his breath, his heart hammering. He turned, ready to defend the ranch, but Elara was already on her feet. She moved with a calmness that startled him, walking toward the door as if she had been waiting for this moment. He called after her, told her to stay back, but she did not pause. Her hand pushed open the door, and she stepped into the yard, her thin frame outlined by the moon, her tangled hair loose in the wind. The riders jeered at first, circling closer, their masks hiding their faces but not their voices. They spat the word cursed like it was a weapon, daring her to deny it, daring her to crumble. But Alara did not crumble. She lifted her chin, her voice rising for the first time since Thomas had known her, not shrill, not frantic, but steady and sharp. She spoke words that cut deeper than any bullet, naming them one by one, calling out things only those men would know. She told one that his youngest son still cried in the night from dreams he pretended not to have. Told another that his wife prayed for mercy while he spent his wages in the saloon. Told another that the scar under his mask was not from war, but from a brawl he lost in shame. The riders froze, their bravado cracking as her voice rolled through the night, calm and relentless. Thomas stood in the doorway, the rifle still heavy in his hands, but he did not lift it. He only watched as the girl everyone called cursed held a pack of armed men at bay with nothing but her voice. One shifted in his saddle, muttering. Another cursed low, and then, as if on some unspoken signal, they pulled their horses back. The circle broke, hooves pounding as they scattered into the hills, their threats lost in the distance. The yard grew quiet again, the only sound, the faint rattle of the broken window in the wind. Alara turned back to Thomas, her pale eyes steady, and for a moment he saw no curse in her at all, only strength, raw and unyielding. She stepped inside without a word, sat back at the table, and folded her hands in her lap. Thomas closed the door, his heart still racing, and realized that whatever secret she carried, it was stronger than fear, strong enough to drive shadows away. The fire burned low that night, the wood snapping soft as Thomas leaned back in his chair and watched the shadows crawl across the walls. Alara sat opposite him, her pale eyes reflecting the glow, her hands folded around a tin cup she had not touched. The house was quiet except for the crackle of the flames, yet there was a weight in the air, the kind that pressed until words had no choice but to come. She looked at him once, as if to measure whether he could bear what she carried, then turned her gaze back to the fire and began to speak. Her voice was low, steady, not the voice of a child, but of someone who had long since learned the cost of silence. She told him her father had been a miner, a man who worked deeper than most dared to go. Where others stopped, fearing collapse or empty veins, he dug further, chasing the shimmer of silver through the black stone. One day he struck rich, richer than anyone had expected, and for a moment the family believed the fortune had come. But fortune breeds envy quicker than it breeds peace. Men whispered that no ordinary miner could find what he found, that it was not skill but some unnatural favor. When he vanished into the shaft one morning and did not return, they said the ground itself had swallowed him whole, not because of greed or accident, but because of her. Elara's fingers tightened on the cup as she spoke, her eyes fixed on the flames. She remembered the way neighbors looked at her, not with pity but with suspicion, as though her very breath had pulled her father into the earth. Her mother had sickened soon after, fever taking her with cries that echoed through the night, and the whispers grew louder, sharper, saying the girl had brought ruin on her own kin. When her mother's body was laid in the ground, no one offered her a home out of kindness, only a place for a short while before passing her on again, each family eager to rid themselves of her shadow. She was dragged from house to house, sometimes fed, sometimes beaten, never kept, always abandoned. Thomas listened without speaking, the rifle across his knees forgotten, his eyes fixed on her, as if each word filled in a piece of a picture he had only guessed at before. She paused often, not because she faltered, but because the memories weighed heavy. He could see it in her shoulders, the way they sagged between sentences, yet she did not stop. She wanted the truth spoken, even if it scraped her raw. When she fell quiet at last, The fire had burned down to embers, the room dim and hushed. Thomas leaned forward, his elbows on his knees, and said only that curses were not carried in blood, they were planted in lies. She looked at him then, her face unreadable, but her eyes softer, as if she had heard something she had waited years to hear. The silence that followed was not heavy, but settled, like dust after a storm, and Thomas knew the story she had given him was not a burden but a trust, one he would not cast aside. The morning was cool when Elara asked him to follow, her voice steady but quieter than the wind slipping through the grass. Thomas saddled the mare without questions, though he carried the weight of her request in his chest. She led the way on foot, moving with a sure stride, as if every turn of the trail was etched in her bones. They climbed the low hills that rose beyond the pasture, the land rugged and scarred by old cuts of stone where miners had once clawed at the earth. Thomas remembered stories from years past, of fortunes promised and men ruined, but he had never ridden this far into the hills himself. By noon the sun pressed hot against their backs, and she stopped at a thicket of brush, clinging to the side of a ridge. Without hesitation she pushed through, her thin hands pulling branches aside until a dark mouth opened in the stone, half hidden, half waiting. Thomas stepped close, his eyes narrowing at the shaft, its frame of rotted timbers still holding, though the years had worn them down. He felt the cool breath of the mine on his skin, and for a moment the air seemed heavy, as though the earth remembered the men it had swallowed. Elara lifted a lantern she had carried and struck it alight, the glow catching on her pale eyes before spilling into the shaft. She did not look back to see if he would follow, only stepped inside, the dust rising around her boots. Thomas hesitated, then ducked beneath the timbers and moved after her, his broad shoulders brushing the walls. The air was damp, close, carrying the smell of stone, and something sharper beneath. Their steps echoed in the narrow dark, until at last the lantern's light fell across the wall and the silver veins gleamed. Thin and jagged, like lightning frozen in rock, they ran along the stone with a shimmer that no dust could hide. Elara lifted the lantern higher, her face half shadow, half fire, and said in a voice without tremor that this was what men had killed for. Her father had found it, and when he vanished they claimed it was because of her. They had needed a reason for their envy, a shield for their greed, and a child's pale eyes made the easiest target. The curse was never hers, she said. It belonged to the mine, to the hunger it stirred in men who would spill blood for what lay under the earth. Thomas reached out, his fingers brushing the cold stone, the silver sharp against the lantern light. He thought of the riders who had circled his ranch, of the whispers in town, of the way children taunted her, as if cruelty were a game. He thought of the night she stood against masked men with nothing but her voice and sent them scattering. He understood now that it was not fear of her that held people, but fear of their own sins made clear in her presence. When they stepped back into the sunlight, the hills seemed changed, the air cleaner, as if truth itself had been buried too long. Elara let the brush fall back across the opening, hiding it once more. She turned to Thomas, her face calm but her eyes fierce, and said that the mine had taken her family, but it would not take her name. He nodded, the weight of her words heavy as stone, and together they walked down the ridge, leaving the earth to keep its silver and its ghosts. Word of silver travels quicker than wind across dry grass, and before long the hills around the ranch were not quiet anymore. Men who once laughed at Thomas in the saloon now tipped their hats with sharp grins, their eyes not on him but on the land he rode over. Horses appeared at the edges of the pasture, riders watching with the hunger of vultures circling a wounded beast. Neighbors who had avoided him before suddenly stopped by, asking questions with voices too casual, pretending concern while their gaze drifted toward the hills. Thomas said little, but he felt the weight pressing down harder with every passing day. The truth he and Elara had seen now, twisted into rumor and greed. The sheriff came next, riding up in dust and leather, his badge glinting under the noon sunday. He was a man known to be swayed by coin more than law, and his eyes held no warmth when he told Thomas to keep clear of the mine. He said the land belonged to no one, that once silver was spoken of, it became a matter bigger than one ranch. Thomas asked whose matter it had become, and the sheriff only smirked, saying promises had been made. Men with influence were already circling, and Thomas would be wise not to stand in the way. It was a warning dressed in civility, but Thomas heard the threat under it. He had seen enough of the sheriff's dealings to know when pockets were already lined. That night, Thomas sat on the porch, the weight of the rifle heavy across his knees, and wondered how long before force came riding to his door. Elara sat beside him in silence, her hair catching what little light the moon gave. She did not look afraid, not the way a child might be, though she was still only 14 by years. Instead, her face carried the same steady calm she had shown when riders circled the ranch, the calm of someone who had lived through worse and refused to bow. When Thomas muttered that maybe it was time to pack, to slip away before things turned violent, she turned to him with eyes sharp as steel. She said she would not run any more, her voice firm though low, and if they wanted her curse, then they would have to face it, head on. Thomas studied her in that moment and saw not the thin, unwanted girl handed over like a burden, but someone forged harder than the hills themselves. He thought of the silver glinting in the mine, of the way men killed for less, and he felt both fear and something close to pride rise in his chest. He knew standing with her meant standing against the town, against neighbors, against law twisted by greed, but he also knew he could not ask her to bear it alone. The world had thrown her away too many times already. The night grew quiet again, but the peace was thin, stretched like old cloth ready to tear. In the distance coyotes howled, and Thomas knew the days ahead would test them both. Yet when Elara met his gaze, steady and unbroken, he felt a strength settle in him that no sheriff's threat could shake. The sky was just beginning to pale when the first sound of hooves stirred the ground, steady and sure, as if the earth itself had known they were coming. Thomas rose from the porch, the rifle already in his hands, his body stiff with a resolve that felt heavier than his own bones. Elara stood at his side, her thin frame wrapped in the same blanket she had carried since the night he brought her home. The air was sharp, the kind of air that carried every sound, and soon the riders appeared in a line against the horizon, rifles gleaming in the faint light of dawn. They came down the ridge slow but steady, spreading wide as they reached the canyon floor, their faces hard, their voices calling for Thomas to step aside. They said the mine was not his, said he was harboring a cursed witch who had no claim to anything but shame. Their words rose like smoke, bitter and cruel, but before Thomas could lift his rifle to answer them, Elara stepped forward. She moved past him with a calm that made his chest seize, her small figure walking into the open where the first rays of light struck her pale eyes. She spoke then, her voice carrying across the canyon with a strength that surprised even him. She told them the land was her father's, that he had dug where no man dared, that his blood had soaked the soil they now sought to steal. She said the curse was not hers but theirs, for turning envy into cruelty, for killing with whispers and cowardice. Her words did not shake, did not falter, and in the growing light she looked less like a child, and more like something forged from the very stone of the hills. The men shifted in their saddles, mutters running through their ranks, and Thomas saw fear flicker where once there had only been mockery. It startled him to see her pale eyes hold more power than the rifle in his grip, and for the first time he believed they might win. But pride and greed are not easily undone. One rider lifted his gun, the crack of the shot splitting the dawn. Dust burst at Elara's feet, and Thomas raised his rifle in answer, the report echoing off the canyon walls. The stillness shattered into chaos, bullets cutting the air, horses rearing as shouts turned into curses. Thomas fired steady, his body braced against the earth, while Elara darted behind the rocks, gathering rounds and shouting warnings sharp and clear. They fought not as rancher and cursed girl, but as two bound by something fiercer than blood. The dust rose thick, choking the light, yet through it he caught sight of her, standing tall for a moment on a boulder, her voice rising again, fierce and unbroken, telling them they would never take what her father died for. By the time the gunfire thinned and the canyon fell quiet, bodies lay scattered, some wounded, some fled. The survivors pulled back, their bravado broken, their eyes carrying the same fear they once tried to lay on her. Thomas lowered his rifle, his breath ragged, and turned to Elara. She was covered in dust, her hair tangled, but her gaze was steady, unflinching. Together they had held the ground, and in that moment he knew no curse had ever lived in her, only a strength the world had tried and failed to bury. When the smoke cleared, the canyon lay still, the mine hidden again behind its curtain of brush, and the vultures who had circled so bold scattered into the sky with nothing to feast on but their own shame. The sheriff rode out that afternoon with a pair of deputies, their faces set hard as if they still meant to enforce the law. But one look at the ground where rifles had been fired and men had bled left them quiet. He made a show of telling Thomas to keep his hands clean, said disputes over silver were for courts and owners with papers, but his words lacked weight. He saw the look in Elara's eyes, the same look that had scattered armed men at dawn, and he shifted in his saddle, like a man who suddenly remembered his own smallness. When he left, no threats lingered, only the knowledge that this fight had not been his to win. Elara stood beside Thomas through it all, her thin shoulders squared, her pale eyes steady. She was not cursed, not unwanted, not abandoned, but something far stronger, claimed by herself first, by the land second, and finally by the man who had chosen to believe in her worth when no one else had. The house no longer felt empty, not even in silence. She moved through it like she had been born there, sweeping floors, tending stock, mending with needle and thread, her hands shaping order out of what had nearly fallen apart. Thomas worked beside her, patching fences and tilling what soil would still give, and though the debts weighed heavy, they did not drown him. He traded just enough of the silver hidden in the hills to keep them alive, careful not to draw the hunger of outsiders, careful to use it for survival, not for greed. Seasons turned, and the ranch grew stronger. The weak mare that once staggered under her own weight now carried Elara across the pasture with her head high, and calves born in spring grew fat enough to sell come autumn. The well, though never full, gave enough to keep the soil from turning to dust, and when storms rolled across the horizon, Thomas felt less fear and more resolve. He was not fighting alone anymore. Each morning when he rose to the sight of Elara, feeding the chickens or hauling water, he knew the land had finally given something back, something he had never expected. Evenings were quiet, filled with the hum of crickets and the crackle of the fire. Sometimes Elara would sit on the porch with a book scavenged from town, her lips moving soundlessly as she taught herself the words, and Thomas would sit beside her, the silence between them no longer heavy, but full. One evening, as the sun burned red across the hills, setting the sky aflame with color, she turned to him and whispered the word home. Her voice carried the weight of every place she had been cast aside, every lie told about her, every mile walked in silence, and yet it rang clear. Thomas, who had once believed he would die with nothing but dust in his hands, whispered it back, and for the first time in years, it did not feel like a lie. If this story left its mark on you, subscribe, like, and saddle up for more videos.